Okay, let's talk about CSS and consistency of our UIs. Actually, Sarah, I was going to talk about Flexbox a little bit. But don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm Artem. As Sarah said, I work at Wayfair as front-end developer, and I contribute quite a lot to our design system. And that's my dog. I also created a tool called React Style Guidist. It's a tool to help you create your React components and style guides. So what's the problem with CSS? And for me, the problem is this, or this, or this. Kind of the same white doors, but each of them have a slightly different shade of white, slightly different border radius, slightly different box shadow. But they all should be the same. So the problem is consistency. I did a little analysis of one of my past projects, and I found out that the sources of custom CSS are just two. First is typography, mostly font sizes. And second is white space and layout, margin, padding, and layouts like Flexbox. And we had a lot of components that had just one or two lines of styles like this. And I think CSS is too expressive. You can create a million of different button designs with CSS, which is cool. But probably on a project, you only need one. Can we fix that? I think yes. And the first step would be introduction of design tokens. Design tokens are all design decisions on your project, like colors, gradients, white space, font sizes, and everything you use more than once in your styles. There are many ways to implement design tokens. You can define them as preprocessor variables, as CSS custom properties, if you don't have to support older IE, or JavaScript constants if you use CSS and JS. Or you can even use JSON and share design tokens with different platforms like iOS or Android. So if we use design tokens in our UIs, in our styles, we can be sure that we use the same values for spacing, for font sizes, for colors, everywhere. That improves consistency of our user interface. But not all token combinations are good. For example, we can create a very small, very light gray text, but we use consistent values for our project still. But can you read this? There is a text on the right side. I can't read it, but it's there. I know it. I put it here. Can we fix that problem? And I think the solution is writing less styles manually. I'm not saying that CSS is a bad language and you shouldn't learn it. Quite the opposite. I just think that it's not the right tool for some use cases. And there are better tools. And I think the solution is the primitive components. Andrei did a great talk yesterday, and he explained what it is and why we should write them. And I will show you how to do this, how to write primitive components and how to use them to improve consistency user interfaces. Let's start with typography. We can create a text component that we're going to use, that you can use to render all text in your application. Text with different styles like normal, secondary, or error message. The number of styles depends on your project and your use cases. But you need to find the minimum number of styles to cover most of the use cases for your application. What else do we need in our component? Custom HTML element like paragraph, span, or label. That's useful. Alignment could be useful. It could be part of the component ABI. Oops. White space also could be part of the component API, or it could be a separate component, or both. How are we going to select a style in our component? We can use a Boolean prop like primary. Looks good. We have a secondary style. We add another Boolean prop. Oh, what's that? Action required. No, sorry, can't do that. Just hi, go away, go away. I just don't know what will happen if I click the WOD button. maybe my laptop will explode and I won't be able to finish the talk. That's the most interesting part of it. Okay. But eventually, someone will try to use primary, secondary button, and we don't know what's going to happen. So better to use a single enum property, for example, variant, that you will use to define a style like primary or secondary. And this makes it, basically it makes impossible states impossible. Another consideration is rigidity or flexibility. We can make our component rigid and allow very limited number of styles. Or we can have multiple properties to change colors, sizes, and other style properties. Both solutions are good, and it depends on your particular use case, size of your application, and stuff like that. Custom element. By default, we can render a paragraph, which is good for most cases. But sometimes we want to use it inline, and we need a span. So we can create a Boolean property, like we was trying to do with primary and secondary. But what if you need to do a label, for example, or any other HTML tag? Are we going to introduce another Boolean property? Maybe not. Maybe better use one like as and just pass a name of an HTML element. And if you're using styled components or emotion, this as property is implemented by default for any component. So you don't have to do anything. And that's how our text component can look in the application code. We have a paragraph of text, and we have some secondary text that we render with a secondary style and semantic HTML small element. And we can create any kind of style in our application without writing any custom CSS, just by using this text component. We can use the same idea to implement a heading component, like the first level heading, second level heading, and so on. Next, spacing and layout. Again, if we use even if we use design tokens directly, it's hard to achieve consistency in the user interface. You may have the same values, but the wrong combination of these values. And to make consistent spacing in the application, we can define a spacing scale. There are two popular ways to do this: linear progression and geometric progression. I personally like the second one because we have smaller number of choices and they're more obvious. Like this one, 28 and 32 pixels are almost the same, and it's hard to choose one of them. Another important thing here is how you name your spacing. Not just spacing, but the scale. You can use like small, medium, large keywords. You can use bootstrap scale. You can use close sizing or just numbers. These are all good ways to define scaling, to name scales. But there are also not so good ways, like Greek alphabet. It kind of looks the same as small, medium, large, but it's very hard, at least for me, to remember the order of like alpha, beta, etc., and the spelling, especially like epsilon. I was trying to use a scale for quite a long time, but I gave up. It's too hard. And that's how we can define our spacing scale in JavaScript. We can use like pixels or rems. And that's how a component for white space can look like in an application code. Again, we define margins between components without writing any custom styles, just by using a single component. We can use the same idea to implement a flexbox component that will allow us to create any kind of flexbox layouts with just these two components, flex and box, for example, without writing any kind of custom styles. Or components makes responsive styling very easy because you can accept an array instead of just a single value. And you can define, for example, different widths or different margins for different device sizes. You can use the same idea to implement a CSS grid component that will allow you to create very complex layout without writing any custom styles, just by using the same component. So how can we implement such components? We can just try to write a plain CSS, but it's going to be very verbose. This is just the amount of JavaScript to support two props. Not two props, but props to define margins and padding. And this is basically just managing class names, nothing else. But you will need much more CSS to implement these class names. It's getting simpler with CSS and JS, but still quite verbose. And I think the best solution is styled system library by Brent Jackson. It's a toolkit to build primitive UI components that allow you to control styling with component props. It gives you access to your design tokens, so your UIs are going to be consistent. And each prop is responsive by default. Out of the box, you have margins, paddings, and so on, and it works with pretty much any CSS and JS solution. That's all we need to define the spacing component using styled system. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code instead of these or this. So to recap what we learned today and why I think we should use primitive components instead of writing custom styles. We can define an API of the component with less number of choices, which will give us more consistent user interface. Component API is more discoverable. It's easier to understand what component support than looking at the class names. The development is getting faster because you have a toolkit of primitive components that you can compose and create many different kinds of user interfaces. It promotes code reuse because you don't write a lot of custom styles. You use already existing primitive components. Code reviews are getting easier because every time you see some custom styles, it's either a signal that you need to rewrite the styles using existing components, or it's really something custom and CSS is required. It's easy to generate documentation with tools like StyleGuideist or Storybook. And it's easy to make these primitives accessible. For example, by defining a text component with limited number of styles, you can make sure that all the styles are accessible. For example, they have enough color contrast. And by defining these primitive components, you're creating a common language between designers and developers, like Andre was explaining yesterday. I believe we should not, or should strive for not writing styles in the application code. And we should hide styles in primitive components and then just compose user interfaces from these components. If you have a good design system, you should be able to create a perfect user interface, even if the mockup was drawn on a piece of napkin. It should be clear which components and which design tokens to use. And that's pretty much what we teach with Andre on our workshops. And we just started a component-driven IO site. It's kind of empty now, but we're going to publish some good content about components, about tokens, about this kind of stuff. So please subscribe. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.